Welcome everybody. Good evening. This is our eighth and final session of Mishnah in Depth with Masechet Ketubot. This course is a project of Drisha's Rivka Rosenwein's Zichron Livracha's Mishnah division and is sponsored in memory of Rivka Rosenwein. As you come into the Zoom room, I will, as usual, invite you to become a panelist. It doesn't mean you're expected to speak on any kind of panel. It just means that you can choose to put on your camera so we can see your lovely smiling faces. And when Rabbanit Sarna invites questions and comments, you will be able to unmute yourself to ask. We just ask that you keep yourself on mute when you're not speaking. It minimizes the background noise so we can all hear each other. Your questions and comments are always welcome in the chat. I will read them out for you if you don't want to unmute and speak yourself. Yes, also I will be sharing the source sheet in the chat if you want to follow along independently. And I think with that, I will be passing over to Rabbanit Sarna.
Hello, everyone. This is our last class together on Ketubot, which is so sad. Lily Naz, if you have it, we should definitely put the sign up link for the Nidarim class into the chat also, so that while you're listening to this class, if you're like, oh wow, I really want to make sure I get Zoom links for Nidarim coming up starting this Sunday with Rabbi Silber. So definitely make sure you sign up for that. It's going to be great. Rabbi Silver is teaching Nidarim specifically because he was like, I have so much to say about Nidarim. So you don't want to miss it. His Torah is, I mean, obviously, you're a Drisha, you know. His Torah is incredible. And whenever he's particularly excited about a topic, you know it's going to be amazing. So I really, really, really want to encourage everyone to make sure that you sign up for that. And we'll also follow up by email in case you missed the chance during this class. So this is our last evening together on Ketubot. We're gonna go back to, I know last week we spent the whole time on one topic, and that was, I'm sure, very relieving to some people, but we're back into hodgepodge land tonight. There were a bunch of things that really sort of caught, I don't know, like sparked my interest. Some of it carrying up on themes from last week where we talked about the almanah, the unique status of the widow, and we'll see. There's some interesting material about her today as well, and I'm interested. It's a bit of a hodgepodge, but there's like a line that draws together tonight a little bit about quality of life, and that as a theme that emerged in the last two prakim of Ketubot. I didn't limit myself to only those themes, but that's sort of one of the unifying ideas that we'll talk about tonight. So with all that introduction, just one other technical piece. Those of you who have been with us before know the drill. Feel free to interrupt me when I'm sharing screen. It's just very hard to see if people are like raising their hands or something like that. So just come off mute, interrupt, and if I'll just say to you like, hold on one second, if I'm trying to finish an idea, or you can put stuff in the chat, and then Lily Nods will be the brave interrupter. She does a great job. So that is what we are going to do tonight. Okay, here we go. All right, ooh, all the way at the bottom. Okay, here we go. Okay, so the first thing that I wanted to go to is in the 12th chapter, and we're back or we're continuing basically on our theme from last week. We're talking about the widow. And here we have Almana she'amra ifshi lazuz mi beit ba'ali ein hayorshim yochlim lomar la lechi leveit abich va'anu zaninotach ela zaninotah beveit ba'ala v'notnim la mador lefi chvoda. So a widow who says, I don't want to leave my husband's house. But you can imagine, right? Like when we're imagining widows, we talked about this last week, it can span this huge range of situations. It could be a woman who got married at age 12 and a half, and now she's 14 and her husband died. And we'll see that later. You could be a woman who her husband died at a ripe old age, and now she's also at a ripe old age, but still kind of kicking, still kicking, and then potentially has many years ahead of her. And those are two, and anything in between, right? It could be a mom who's 40 years old, her husband just died, and she has 10 little kids, there's just so many different situations that get all wrapped up into the almanah. And we saw in the Midrash last week, we saw when the Torah offers protections for the almanah, it's not just the poor almanah. The Midrash understands the psukim to mean even the almanah, even the widow of a king gets the types of protections that are offered to the almanah as this like vulnerable member of society. Okay, so in our case, we have an almanah who says, I don't want to leave my husband's house. The inheritor, so she is not an inheritor. She has rights. Remember from last week, she has rights to her ketubah, and until she collects her ketubah, she has rights also to mizonot, to like sustenance was the translation we liked for that. So the inheritors, i.e. the sons, and they're not necessarily her sons, right? They could be her husband's sons from other marriages that he had. They cannot say to her, nope, you have to go back to your father's house. We don't want you to live with us. We'll still give you mizono, but you'll eat that mizono in your husband's house. Like we'll still provide for your food and sustenance, but you'll consume it there. No, says the Mishnah, they're not allowed to do that. Rather, they have to provide for her sustenance in her departed husband's house, and they have to give her living quarters, lefi chvuda, according to her dignity or befitting her dignity. So I'm very interested in like calculations of dignity. So we're going to look at the Gemara about that in a second, but let's just finish the Mishnah. So Amra, if she lazuz mi beit Abba, and if she says, I don't want to move from my father's house. So the first case is I don't want to move from my husband's house. Now it's I don't want to move from my father's house. The inheritors are entitled to say, if you're living with us, we will provide your sustenance. And if you're not living with us, we will not provide your sustenance. I didn't go there, but the Gemara on this, I'm just going to flag it. It has this amazing idea that's mostly seems to be generated by Rav, which is that the more people living in your house, the more bracha is in your house. And this idea that actually, like, if you have a house full of people, it's cheaper because I think it's the Gemara, maybe it's one of the Parshanim I was looking at now, I don't remember. They suggest that, like, if there's like one person eating alone, then they need like 5 ounces or whatever of food. But if it's 4 people eating together, then really they only need like 18 or whatever. Like it just somehow like portion sizes shrink, and like it just there's benefits and cost saving elements to like more people living together, not to mention all those people kind of like pitch in and support each other and bring in like income and all of those things. So it's just sort of funny because it's like we don't normally think like the more people shoved into a house, the more bracha there is. We're sort of usually like, well, that sounds noisy and full of disease. And the Gemara has like a really opposite take on that. So just flagging that as something interesting to look into. And that's how they kind of understand this idea where the Yorshim are allowed to say, no, like we're paying for your mizono only if you live with us. Because if you live with us, you're part of our household economy. And if you're not living with us, then take your ketubah. But there's an exception, which points to what I was saying at the beginning about the almana being a kind of confusing category because it could really be so many different women in different stages and situations of life. So the last line of the Mishnah is Im haitato enet mibnei shehi yalda v'hem yaladim zani nota v'hi b'veit avia. But if she claims that she needs to live in her father's home because she is a child and they are children, by that they don't mean like literally. I mean, she might be literally a child, but I don't think that's the intention here. I think it's like my husband's first wives had children immediately, and he married me at a young age, 12 years after he married them. And so his oldest sons are the same age as me. she's prohibited from marrying those sons. It's not some, like, I know in the Torah with Tamar, it kind of feels like Yibum works that way, but I don't want to say like in real life, but in rabbinic Judaism, Yibum does not work that way. Yibum does not work intergenerationally. So the household has responsibilities towards her, but they are not sexual. And so if she's worried, like it doesn't look good, or it cuts off my prospect, or like I am afraid or something like that, which is reasonable. I mean, we see in the Torah, like Reuven sleeps with his father's wife, right? Like Reuven sleeps with Bilhah. It's not crazy to say that the son of one of your husband's other wives might wanna be sexual with you. If it happens in the Torah, I guess it could happen anywhere. That's not true for a lot of things, actually. But anyways, the family dynamics of the Torah can happen anywhere. And so we're concerned about that, and we allow that concern to have legal repercussions. So that the Reuven Bilhah concern, I guess you could say, it can means that even though normally if she wants to live in her father's home, she can't continue to collect mizonot, in that case she can, which I think is really like sensitive to the diversity of almana experiences that are possible. I did just want to point one thing out about this Mishnah. So some of you might be familiar. There's a long-standing, at this point, scholarly debate whether the Tosefta precedes the Mishnah or postdates the Mishnah. I am not sufficiently a scholar as to have an opinion on that matter. But it is always very interesting when the Mishnah and the Tosefta say different things. And that's usually when scholars who have big opinions on whether the Tosefta is before or later, that's usually like they jump in on that and try and read it in all different ways. So anyways, okay. So in our Mishnah, they have to give her housing. They can't kick her out of the house, and they have to provide her housing lefi kvuda, in accordance with her dignity. In the Tosefta, we have our parallel. Amana shamra ef she lazuz mi beit ba'ali ena yorshim yacholin. Okay, so here's where we saw those exact words in the Mishnah. A widow who says, "I don't want to leave my husband's house," the inheritors are not allowed to. And in the Mishnah, they're not allowed to say to her. But here it is, ena yorshim yacholim la'akiv al yada. They're not allowed to prevent her. But why? In the Mishnah, it seems to be about her dignity and her honor and her rights. And in the Tosefta, it's shakachu kvodo shel ba'ala, that it's actually about the dignity of the deceased. It's about the dignity of the widow's ex-husband. What would it look like for him and for his honor if his wives were treated poorly after his death? And there's so many interesting things. These prakim are incredible. If you're ever looking for like wonderful, interesting prakim to learn in the Bavli, the last two prakim, I mean the last parak in particular, and we'll talk about that more. The last two prakim of Ketubot are unbelievable. And anyways, so something that where this kind of leads into in the Gemara when they're thinking about all these topics, and Safrai point this out in their commentary on the Mishnah, is it leads into the story that appears in the Bavli and in the Yerushalmi in pretty similar ways about Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's death. And one of his dying wishes is that his wife should be taken care of, and she should be taken care of like in the same way that he was that she was kind of taken care of by him in his lifetime, and that's one of the things that he tells his sons and his students to be careful about. And what Safrai argue is that is it's about his kavod. It's about the kavod of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, that his wife after his death should be treated well. So they kind of read it into this Tosefta, but you could, depending on whether you think the Tosefta comes before the Mishnah or after the Mishnah, you get to tell a very different story, right? So if the Tosefta came before the Mishnah, then what you get to say is, well, they had this very patriarchal stance, and the Mishnah actually made it much more about her. But if the Tosafta postdates the Mishnah, then you tell the opposite of that story. So, anyways, however you string it together, totally sort of changes the end result there. But I want us to look. The Gemara here is very interesting, and then yeah, the Gemara. Just look the Gemara on like what is dignity. How do you lefi kvoda, like how do you quantify that? So here we go. So it's Rabbanan, Mishtameshet b'mador kederach shemishtameshet b'chayei ba'ala. So a widow, she remains in her husband's house. She uses the living quarters in the same manner that she used them in her husband's lifetime. So it's not the case that she has to like move out of her room or something like that. Like, no, she lives the exact same way as if her husband was still alive. She gets avadim ushvachot kedarach shemishtameshet b'chayei ba'ala. So all of the sleeves and maid servants stay the same for her. Karim satot kedarach shemishtameshet b'chayei ba'ala. All of the kind of creature comforts, pillows and sheets, she gets to use the same way as when he was alive. And she also gets to use the same kind of fancy utensils that she used in her husband's life. So one of her, daughters-in-law or whatever doesn't get to say like, these are mine now, you have to use plastic or whatever. Like, no, the manner in which she's accustomed to living, she gets to continue to live. And this might be ringing some bells for people who have learned the halachot of tzedakah. It's a very, I didn't bring it here because I like wanted us to see a lot of different things, but it's very reminiscent of that, right? Like someone loses everything, where do we have to restore them to? We have to restore them to the level of quality of life to which they were accustomed. So here we're not restoring anything, we're maintaining, but it still feels kind of very reminiscent of that same thing. It's not like, oh, you're an almana, here's your mizono, like that's what you're entitled to, goodbye. It's like, no, it's not just about like an entitlement. You're entitled to the same level of lifestyle that you had had before this happened to you. Which is sometimes not how we think about entitlement, certainly not in America, but it is, I think, at least, one strain of way of thinking about entitlements in the Talmud. Okay. And so where do they take this from? They take it from a Mishnah that we looked at last time, from the fourth parak. We brought it last time, even though it's in the fourth parak of Ketubot, because there's like this implied or in fact written clause of the Ketubah, shekach katav la va'at tehei yat vat beveiti umitzina minechsai kol yemei magar armelutech beveiti. So you will reside in my house, be sustained from my property all the days that you live in my house as a widow. But Rav Yosef makes like a into the clause. So Tani Rav Yosef beveiti velo bevikti. So Rav Yosef says, in my house, yes, but not in my shack. So meaning, if the house is too small and it's not a dirat kavod maybe anyways. So like we see we talked about this in my Hanukkah class for any of you who were happen to be in that one. Oh yeah, look at us, you were. But right, there's like an idea, like the Gemara has ideas about what makes a dirat kavod, like what makes a house. And so if it doesn't fit it, so, and for example, like you think about that in terms of like, what is a space that's obligated and having a mezuzah? That's like the classic way of thinking about a house. So Rav Yosef is saying, like, if it's not a dignified residence in the first place, then she does not continue to have rights vis-a-vis this non-dignified shack. But and so he's kind of like making that like diuk into the Mishnah. Okay, just to continue here, Rav Nachman says, "Yetomim shemachru medor almana lo asu v'lo klum." This is a really interesting element of Ketubot, which I hope you've noticed as a theme just as you're learning through. So Rav Nachman says, the inheritors, the orphans, but in this case, the orphans are like the people attempting power over the widow, right? It's funny, like you don't normally think that there's like a power imbalance between an almana and yatomim, but there actually is male yatomim, and we're going to talk about female yatomim soon. male yatomim are much more empowered than the almanah. And so, right, everything we're seeing is sort of like her suing them for different things, or her trying to, maintain her rights. Okay, so Rav Nachman says, right, orphans who sold the living quarters of a widow, lo asu v'lo klum, they did not do anything. The sale is invalid, and that's like a thing that recurs in Ketubot, or like, you can't, it's not your property. You can't sell it off. You don't have rights to it. And that, and like what property that belongs to a family member that isn't quite who they imagine it should belong to, or whatever. That's sort of like, do I have power to sell this off or not? This sort of a theme through Masechet Ketubot, much more so in the Gemara. Anyway, so here we see that they're not allowed. You might think, because they are the inheritors of the estate, that like they can sell the estate if they want to, but actually they can't, because they can't sell her room. And if they try and sell her room, the sale doesn't have effect. So that's like also, I think, really, really interesting. But it gets complicated. So Abaye is gonna now try, and we're trying to limit her rights here a little bit. So Amar Abaye Naktinan Medor Almanash Nafal Ina Yorshim Chayavim Livnota. So Abaye says, we hold that if a widow's living quarters collapsed, the heirs are not obligated to rebuild it, because they're obligated to allow her to continue living in her residence. But if it falls down not by their hand, they're not obligated to fix it. And there's a brayta brought to that effect. Tani Nami Hachi, Midor Manash Nafal Ina Yorshim Chayavim Livnoto. So the living quarters of a widow that fall down, the inheritors are not obligated to rebuild it. Even if she said, okay, I'm gonna pay for the handyman to put my shack back up, or not her shack, her room back together, or whatever it is, in Shom'imla, she is not allowed to do that. And actually, like, once her living quarters fall, like once they're like condemned, she loses her rights to it, which is kind of sad, right? Like this, you get this image of this like woman living in this crumbling place, and it falls down, and now she's totally homeless. And so I find this Gemara like really, really challenging on that front, and it's just such a narrow read of what the obligations are towards this woman. And Abaye then asks, okay, and within that sort of construct, she ptsa mai, what's the halacha if she repairs the house? If she makes a repair, okay, so they don't have to let her repair, but what if before it falls down, she repairs it? Is it as if the house collapsed and she rebuilt it? Or if it's only still standing because of her repairs, then did it like kind of theoretically fall down and she rebuilt it? Or is it like, no, she repaired it, it's still standing, she maintains her rights? And you really would hope that the answer to that would be like, yes. But it resolves in a tiku here, which is just sort of hard. So I didn't want to leave it with like, I wanted to bring this for you, not because it's easy and not because it feels totally right to me. I think there are reads of it which are good, meaning like we do live in a world where a lot of poor elderly people live in very unsustainable and dangerous types of housing. And they live there because that's all they can afford, and there's nobody to take care of them. And frankly, because like governments and societies are not doing their jobs. And so a read of this that's generous is to say, if her housing is falling down, let's not incentivize her to keep living there. Like, let's try and find a different place for her to live. Right? This isn't saying like the kind of effect of this, maybe in my original read of this, the effect of this is homelessness. But if you say, if you lose that assumption, right? If you lose the assumption of like, who would ever make this woman homeless? And instead you say, no, the effect of this is widows should not be living in uninhabitable places. That's why she doesn't have rights to the hut. That's why she doesn't. And that's why if this place falls down, she loses her rights to it. It's not because we want her to be homeless. It's because we want her to live in a more dignified place. And so we don't want her hanging on to this because the only thing left that she has, rather like give up your shack that has fallen apart and move back into your parental home, or move into a different space that maybe you have fewer legal rights to, but that's actually still standing, or something like that. And the removal of legal rights just prevents her from being incentivized to stay in unhealthy living quarters. So that's
Can I
maybe
say
that.
something? Can I
Yeah,
say
please. Hi, Gershon.
the this opinion? This is Abaye, right? Because I
Yes.
can't see it. He's less generous to the almanah than Amos is to almanat in Israel,
Mm.
because Amos says, "Hu yakim lanu et sukat David hanofalet."
Oh, that's a cool read. Oh, I really like that. It didn't occur to me to connect that, but now that you say it, I really, really like it.
And I believe in imitatio Dei, and surely Abaye believed in that principle too.
Well, yeah, I guess what if I was Abaye, what I would say back to you is don't imagine that this woman is living in the Beit HaMikdash. Meaning that the place of this, like, don't imagine that it's such a like fancy, beautiful thing that just happens to have been, ransacked by by the whatever Babylonians. But yes, no, I love it. I think what you're pointing out is very beautiful. Shkoyach.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so on to the next topic. There's this incredible line. I remember this basically this exact same Mishnah appears in Ketubot and in Bava Batra, which makes a lot of sense because Bava Batra is also all about inheritance. And not all of Bava Batra, but a good portion of Bava Batra is about inheritance. So this Mishnah appears there as well. It's always obviously people who like to learn mishnayot al haseder get a feel for like, oh yeah, like there's a whole bunch of mishnayot that actually appear in multiple places, and it sort of gives you this sense of like, yeah, like maybe these mishnayot existed and these teachings kind of existed in these units before they were like organized into tractates in this way, if they're going to appear in more than one tractate. Anyways, but it sort of just gives you a feel for like what might have pre-existed the Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's like ordering of the Mishnah, the fact that the same exact Mishnah might appear somewhere else within the ordering. So anyway, so it's just a very striking Mishnah, especially when you read it as a woman. So we are introduced in the 13th chapter of Ketubot to a rabbi, or a halachic thinker named Admon, and he dissents from the rabbis in 7 cases. Unlike other people who dissent in a number of cases, so for example, like in Adriu, we will encounter a Kavya ben Mahalalel who dissents from the rabbis in a number of cases. And for a Kavya ben Mahalalel, he gets excommunicated and dies or by many accounts dies in excommunication. And Admon disagrees, and like sometimes he's convinced.
Isn't he quoted in Pirkei Avos?
A Kavya ben Mahalalel? Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah, it's wild. He's like a really fascinating character, but then, right, he also is maybe considered a Zaki and Mamre. Like there's just a lot. He's like, Debbie, you should do a dive into a copy of Ben Mahalal. You will enjoy it. Okay. Okay, so Admon brings 7 dissenting opinions. One of them is as follows: Mishameh, Behiniach, Banim, Uvanot. So someone who dies and he's fortunate, he leaves behind both sons and daughters. If he both had a lot of children and a lot of wealth, easy peasy. So when there's a lot of wealth, the sons inherit the estate, but that estate, then they have responsibility to feed their sisters off of the estate. But the nechasim ma'atim, but there's a lot of children and not a lot of money. So then the whole estate goes towards the sustenance of the daughters, and the sons are sent out to go beg. So that like sounds horrible and crazy, but on the other hand, like the sons have all of this kind of economic access to jobs and opportunities that the daughters really don't have. So, you know, you can imagine there's a world in which it's like, all right, let's marry these daughters off quickly or something like that. But like basically, if the daughters don't have mizonot, you know, maybe they'll also be able to knock on doors and beg, but more likely is like they'll be sold into slavery or into marriages at way too crazy young an age that would make us all uncomfortable. So this idea that we're like if there's only a small amount of estate, that the daughters should be protected and we send the sons out to fend for themselves, like to me that kind of seems reasonable, but to Admon it doesn't seem reasonable. So Admon says as follows: Bishvil she'ani zachar hifsadeti. What, just because I'm a boy, I should lose out? Which is just like such an astonishing line. It's sort of like, it's like a men's rights activist, Admon. And Rabban Gamliel says, Ro'ani etivrei Admon. You know, that's convincing. So it seems like in Admon's construction, and we'll see in a second, the Gemara tries to make sense of it, but it seems like in Admon's construction, it should just be like whatever mizonot there are, like give it to the boys and girls equally, and then they'll equally kind of have to beg for the rest of it or something like that. Okay, so here's the Gemara in Ketubot that's asking like, my kamar, what are we talking about with regard to Admon's statement, Bishvil shani zachar hifsadeti, which is just like, again, just such a wild sentence. So my kamar,
Are they admonishing him?
Very good. Okay. So Amar Avaya Hachikamar saying, right, this is what he's saying. This is what Admon is saying. Bishvil shani zachar v'ra'ui la'asok b'Torah hifsadeti, because I am a man and I am worthy of and fit to engage in Torah study, I should lose out. Meaning, right, like that's a very confusing sentence. It's sort of like, and Rava's gonna take him to town in a second, but it sort of seems like, what is the main like privilege of being a man? The main privilege of being a man is access to Torah study, as you can see. But historically, right, that was definitely true. And I think part of what Abai is trying to point out is that if you're going to say these sons are going to have no inheritance and they're going to have to beg door to door, then they're really going to lose out because they're not going to have the opportunity to learn Torah. So the fact that they are boys and they are qualified to learn Torah, and then they're not able to they don't have any upkeep or support, so they can't go learn Torah, is I think I think that's what Abai is trying to do here. Like Abai is trying to sort of read into Admon's statement like there's almost like a double tragedy for these boys. But Rava says back, Amalei Rava, Manda asik batora who de yared, manda lo asik batora lo yared. What are you talking about, right? One who do only sons who learn Torah inherit? I know, I'm sure there's plenty of parents who wish that was the rule, but Rava says, right, like the inheritance is not determined based on your your merits or whatever. Like it's not like Torah scholars inherit more from their parents. So it's not about Torah study at all. Rava seems to be saying back to Abaye. Ella Amarava Hachikamar. So Rava says, no, this is what Admon is saying. Bishvil shani zachar v'ra'ui li rash b'nechasim merubim ifsadati b'nechasim muatim. So because I am male, and and it is proper or fitting for me to inherit an estate when it's large. That means I get nothing when the estate is small. Like it just feels like such an imbalance. Like, oh, when the estate is, sons of big estates get everything, and sons of everything, even as compared to their sisters, and sons of small estates get nothing as compared to their sisters. And that is funny, right? Like that really points to the intense disparity between sustenance and inheritance, right? Like girls seem to get this like very sort of concrete maybe it's Lefi Kvoda or something like that, but compared to a large inheritance, it's nothing. But compared to a small inheritance, it's everything. So that the mizonot that girls are eligible for it. And Rava's pointing out in the name of Admon, there's something really strange about that. Like, shouldn't it just always be relative that the boys get more and the girls get less when there's a big estate, and when there's a small estate, the boys get more and the girls get less? And like, nope, not in this case. And Rava's pointing out, and in the voice of Admon, kind of the strangeness of that. And in Bava Batra, this is related to like when this Mishnah appears there. It kind of sets off in a bunch of different directions over there, but this is where maybe you're familiar with Midrash about Avram Avinu when he's blessed Bakol, the debate about whether that means he was so blessed because he didn't have a daughter versus he was blessed because he had a daughter and her name is Bakol. And then Rav Chisda there says, like, I like daughters the best. And that's, if people are familiar with the novels, Rav Chisda's daughters, that's where it kind of like jumps off from that statement of Rav Chisda. So that's like all part of this. Like, if we were,
I'm sorry to keep on interrupting, but it's interesting that Admon seems to be a pioneer in the art of opposition to reverse discrimination.
Yeah, I said he's a men's rights activist.
I'm sorry?
I said he's a men's rights activist.
Yeah, but there's no such thing, is there?
Unfortunately, there is.
Okay, well, you know that, and I don't.
Okay, so just to give you sort of a taste, so we have in this case, what we're talking about is parents who are alive. And so that's obviously like totally different and a whole complicated thing. But when parents are alive, they're actually only on a halachic level obligated to provide for their children up to the age of 6. And then after that, it's like really good to feed them and provide for their education. Beyond that, there's all these ramifications. Like, if you're paying for your kids' D school past the age of 6, can you count that as Meiser? Like, right? So there's really some sort of quite practical ramifications to this idea that your financial obligation to your children sort of ends when they turn 6, even though they're not considered like to have reached majority at that point. Anyways, okay, so the Breita says mitzvah lazunit habanot. So it's a mitzvah. When the Gemara says mitzvah, that's always like a confusing term. Usually it means like good thing to do. And not always, you have to figure it out. But in this case, right, a good thing to do to provide sustenance for your daughters. Kal v'chomer labanim da'askei b'Torah. And how much more so is it a good thing to provide for your sons because they're the ones learning Torah? So you're seeing that same kind of thing, like, oh, like boys deserve more than girls because they are learning Torah. And today I would say they deserve equal because everyone learns Torah. Okay, so that's Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Yehuda says, mitzvah lazun habanim kal v'chomer labanot delo litzalan. So Rabbi Yehuda actually flips it and he says it's a good thing to feed your sons, but how much more so, right? He flips who's the kal and who's the chomer. So okay, right, so Rabbi Meir, it's a good thing to feed your daughters. How much more so is a good thing to feed your sons? And for Rabbi Yehuda, it's a good thing to feed your sons. How much more so is it a good thing to feed your daughters? But the arguments are different. So Rabbi Yehuda removes the Torah component of the argument and instead raises up the idea that it's very easy for girls to become disgraced. But that idea that there's a like Torah for boys but disgrace for girls, we see it still playing out today, right? Like, what's the main mitzvah for girls? Tznius. But like, what's the other side of the coin of tznius is disgrace, right? So like, what we're the most concerned about, I exclude myself from this but many cultures, including within the Jewish community, right? The thing we're the most concerned about for boys is their like Torah study, and the thing we're the most concerned about for girls is their tznius, and we're seeing that coming out here really kind of like screaming, right? That oh, like maybe the boys deserve more because they are learning Torah. Oh no, the girls deserve more because we're afraid of them being disgraced. And like kind of a balance between Torah for boys, CS for girls, which one comes more? This is what we're really concerned about. And again, I would say, we live in very different times now, and all of that. It's maybe more difficult for girls to become disgraced, and also more important than ever for girls to learn Torah. Anyway, so we're just seeing kind of the same kind of resonances of the conversation that I think helps shed light on the Mishnah, where the first assumption in the Mishnah is boys should go knock on doors and not girls. And the assumption behind that girls should not knock on doors is the lo litazlan, that they should not be disgraced, versus Admon's suggestion, which I think gets kind of played out in the Neiman of Rabbi Meir here, which is, and if you follow the first opinion here, if you follow Abaye, which is, no, like boys should have priority because they are learning. Okay. So just to like sort of take this home lahalacha, here's the Rambam. So Misha meet veiniach banim uvanot Yershua banim kol nechasim vehem zanim et achioteim ad shit bagru o ad shit arsu. So someone who dies leaves behind sons and daughters. The sons inherit the estate, and then from that estate they have to provide sustenance for their sisters until they reach majority or until they are betrothed. But what are we talking about here? So we didn't really talk about this before, but like what counts as like a big estate in the Mishnah and what counts as a small estate in the Mishnah? A big estate is an estate which has enough in it to feed all the children until they reach majority. So that doesn't seem like such a big estate, but I guess you can like take that into consideration when you're buying your life insurance policies or whatever. But in any event, so that is the halacha when you have a big estate. But but if there is not enough for everyone to be sustained from the estate until they reach majority, then you set aside from the estate sustenance for the daughters, enough for the daughters until they would reach majority, and then the rest of it gets inherited as like a lump sum by the boys. And if there's only enough for the daughters to be sustained, so the daughters will be sustained by it until they grow up or until they are betrothed, and the sons will beg for support. Which means, right, Admon raises this question, and it seems like Rabban Gamliel supports Admon's question, but lahalacha we follow Tanakama. The lahalacha we don't follow Admon. So in case you were really like as wrinkled as I am, like, oh, just because I'm a man, I should lose out. So like the men's rights activists don't win halachically here. Okay, so just one, right, we've been talking about these cases where you have a father who dies leaving behind children. What happens when a father dies, leaves behind an almana and children? So what happens in that triangle? So just to kind of say a quick word about that, Rabbi Abba says in the name of Rabbi Asi, Asu almana etzel habat kebat etzel ha'achim v'nechasim mu'atim. So he says that you can imagine it like a little chain. So the widow is to the daughter as the daughter is to the sons. Ma bat etzel achin habat nizonet. So just as, and here you start to see why, by the way, why the Rambam paskins like the Tanakama, because here it seems like the Gemara has already paskin like the Tanakama, and obviously the Rambam knows the whole Gemara, so he's noticing, oh, later voices, right? Rabbi Asi is assuming against Admon, and so that's going to be like, if I'm the Rambam, that's important to me, for example. So just kind of pointing that out. So ma bat etzel achim habat nizonet v'achim yishalu al achim. So just as a daughter versus a son, she gets sustenance and the son has to go and beg. Af almana etzel habat, almana nizonet v'habat tisha al haptachim. So too, if there's only enough for either the widow or the daughters, the widow gets fed and the daughters have to go beg. So just to kind of wrap up, and then the Rambam says really the same thing here. But just to sort of wrap up, this is the last thing I'm going to say about the almana, but I think you're really starting to see how protected of a character and a category this woman is, that even vis-a-vis her own daughters or her stepdaughters, she has like a great deal of rights. She's really, really protected by the system. And it's not like the Torah says explicitly that she has any of these rights. In fact, right, it's not clear, like none of the inheritance by daughters or mizonot to daughters is spelled out explicitly in the Torah, which is not the case for the sons inheriting from the father, which is explicitly in the Torah. And yet somehow the rabbis are giving so much power and so much precedence to the almana based on other things that we saw last week that come out from the Torah about the obligation to protect her. I just think that's like, it's very beautiful. And the length to which she gets protected. Okay.
But the daughter also gets protected. There was that whole thing that if there's a husband and then she gets divorced, but the husband promised for 5 years, and then the next husband promised for 5 years, then the two of them take care of her, even if she's living in a different house. That was an interesting, weird scenario also.
Yeah. And it's sort of like the promises that you make to your stepchildren are
right,
still binding promises. No, I also love that. And I love this woman who like divorces a husband who had made a promise to her daughter and then asks the next one to make the same promise to her daughter.
Exactly. So there the focus was not on the wife, not on the almana, or well, there it's divorce, it's not almana, but there the focus was on the daughter.
Yeah, you could say it a few ways. You could say the focus is on the daughter and she gets protected, but the other way you could say it is like it's just like almost like a din in contracts. Like you made a promise to this person, it stands.
Right, irrelevant. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you could find ways to argue it out both ways. Like, is it really about this stepdaughter, which is and we're trying to create a protected class for her, or are we just trying to say like, be careful when you write a ketubot and you make promises, like those promises hold,
Right. The last line was, I think, if I remember, that it's only, the husband says, I will support her, but only as long as you and I maintain a relationship.
So that's the recommendation of how to do this in a not stupid way, right? That's what makes me think it's a din in ketubot, not in, how one should support their stepdaughters. Though, I mean, you would hope that people should support their stepdaughters and should recognize, and we do see, I mean, it's much more a Yavamo conversation than a Ketubot conversation, but like complex family structures, the halacha like has a lot of opinions about how to provide people with protection, and I guess it's also Ketubot, how to provide people protection within those complex families. Okay, so now we're moving back to wives. And so Ketubot 13:10 sketches out that there are 3 different lands for Nisuin. 2 of these we've seen already, and we've seen distinctions between, for example, the Yehuda and the Galil. So we saw it when we talked about whether you can, we saw it with the almanah, we saw whether the sons can kick the almanah out or not, like force her to accept her ketubah or not. And then we saw it also with like when you're
whether ketubah was written or the get was written.
Yeah. So there's all sorts of this, and then there's also in other places. So you see that like multiple aratzot for meiser, multiple aratzot, like it just comes up in a few different places. Safrai on this has a complete list of all the different times where there are multiple aratzot, and sometimes there's 2. The Aver HaYardin is the like is the third that like might not be real, or like doesn't appear in all the lists. Anyway, so within each of those lands, which are Judea, Transjordan, and the Galilee, so you're not allowed to take her from even a city in Yehuda to a city in the Galil, or a krach in Yehuda to a krach in the Galil. Aval ba'otah haaretz, but within Yehuda, let's say, motzi'im me'ir le'ir mikrach lekrach. You are allowed to kind of compel your wife to move from, let's say, Efrat to Kfar Etzion, or something like that, right? Like the assumption is those places are similar enough that like if you need to move for some reason, like she can still visit her parents or whatever, like that. It's the same kind of quality of life. But not from a small town to a big city or the opposite. You're allowed to remove your wife from a disgusting place to a beautiful place. The word naveh it's very interesting. Like in the Torah, naveh usually refers to as like a name for Jerusalem or for the temple. Modern Hebrew loves the name naveh, but it's sort of an interesting like etymology. But you're not allowed to downgrade. So so if she lives somewhere beautiful, you can't drag her to somewhere disgusting. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer, actually, if she lives somewhere disgusting, you cannot just drag her to somewhere beautiful, because a pleasant resident tests the individual. So I'm very interested in Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel's opinion here, and this idea that pretty places sort of, they're bodik, they check you. Like, what does that mean? Oh gosh, we are running low on time. Okay. Okay, well, I'm gonna skip number 11. Number 12 is amazing. It's one of the not so few places where the Gemara quotes Ben Sira. Ben Sira is an apocryphal book of wisdom, and for a long time their scholars debated whether it was originally in Hebrew because we only had it in Greek, and then it plays this really big role with Solomon Schechter realizing that the Geniza, the Cairo Geniza, like was what it was when someone showed him a fragment that he identified as Ben Sira in Hebrew, that then it proved that Ben Sira was originally in Hebrew, and they found more of it in the Cairo Geniza, but that really motivated him to go and like take out as much of the Geniza as he could from Egypt and start to study it. So Ben Sira and its quotations in Hebrew in the Bavli played this kind of big role in Jewish history because of that. But it's also just interesting, like the way the Bavli engages with this text, when other places the Bavli says like you're not allowed to read it. Or the Mishnah says you're not allowed to read Sfarim Chitzonim, which you might correctly translate as apocryphal works, and then itself all over the place is quoting Ben Sira. So big questions about canonization, etc., but for another time. Here we go. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer, he says a pleasant residence tests the individual. My bodik, what is this like testing thing? It's like what Shmuel says. The Amar Shmuel shinui veset tchilat holy me'ayim, a change in habits. We might know the term veset from like Nida land, but veset just means like patterns, rhythms, habits, and here he means eating habits, it seems at least, is the beginning of intestinal disease, which is not crazy, right? Like you eat a totally different food, you eat Indian food, you've never had it before. Yeah, like you might not feel good after that. It's not, like and now we can kind of identify why that is for all different reasons. But one of them is that like your microbial land inside of your digestive system like isn't used to that stuff and doesn't know what to do. And anyways, so Shinui Veset Tchilat Chole Me'ayim. Next time someone wants to drag you to a cuisine you don't want to eat, here's your line. And it says in Ben Sira, Katuv B'Sefer Ben Sira, Kol Yemei Oni Ra'im. So it says in the book of Ben Sira, all the days of the poor are terrible. Koime ani, I guess would be ra'im. All the days of the poor are bad. But how could every day be bad? There's Shabbos and Yantiv, and the assumption here seems to be that on Shabbos and Yantiv, the community provides for nice meals for you. So why would you say that every day is bad? The problem with Shabbos and Yantiv meals, don't we all kind of know this, is that when you change your eating habits, you get stomach aches. And so if you're used to eating like the food of a poor person, and then all of a sudden on Shabbos and Yantiv, you eat like a rich person, that's so nice in your mouth, but it's tchilat choli me'ayin. So in terms of like, what does this then mean in the Mishnah? That's the Gemara ends there, which I think is amazing. But what does it mean? It means like when you change from something that you're used to, you're actually still going to struggle with it. Even if it's from somewhere that someone else identifies as bad, and maybe even you yourself identify as like, this is a gross place to live, this place is full of crime, it's dangerous to live here, it smells bad, whatever it is, still going somewhere else is tchilat choli me'ayin. Like it's still a big, difficult, and maybe illness-inducing transition. And so that's the Gemara's understanding of how it tests you, which I think is just like quite endearing. The Rambam here brings this up. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna sneeze. Sorry.
May I make a suggestion here?
Yeah, please.
On Pesach, we eat lechem oni.
Yep, connected, I think.
It's only because we change our diet.
Yep. And we all know the digestive repercussions of that.
Does anybody say that?
You didn't say that, I did.
No, but does anybody mention Ben Sira when they discuss the Haggadah?
Oh, I don't know.
Expressing the lechem oni.
People do make the joke I just made about like digestive struggle. That's a classic one. Obviously the Gemara's answer is lechem she'onim alav harbe, right? Like things that you answer a lot of questions over it. But I'm not the first person to suggest that maybe it has something to do with digestive struggles. But I don't know if anyone quotes Ben Sira or connects it to here. Where the Rambam connects it, which is source 13 here, is just, he says, in Hilchot Dayot, the Rambam walks through, how is a person supposed to like live in the world? What are you supposed to eat? When are you supposed to eat it? When are you supposed to use the bathroom? Like all of that kind of very specific stuff. The Rambam says, and then he says, all of that is for a healthy person, all the details I just laid out, but a sick person, each one, everyone has to live their life in accordance with their own kind of symptoms and disease. And he says, Kamoshit Ba'er B'Sefer HaRefut, as is clear from all the medical journals, Vishinui Veset Tchilat Choli, and any change from your normal conduct is the beginning of sickness. So the Rambam kind of like codifies this idea in Hilchot Dayot, which is where he's talking about health. So I just thought that was sort of interesting. And just one last idea on this, though, which has been missing until now, is if right, so two ideas actually that come out in the Bartanura that seem important. One is like, if you read our Mishnah, you might think that if someone from the Galil marries someone from Yehuda, like wherever the woman is, like that's where he has to move. But that does not seem to be the case halachically. So Bartanura says, "V'im ish me'eretz hagalil nasa isha be'eretz Yehuda o ipcha kofi notala tit imo sha'almanat kein nasa." It's the assumption of a marriage that she's gonna go live with him. So if he lives in Yehuda and she lives in the Galil, she shouldn't marry a guy from Yehuda if she doesn't want to live there. Like, come on, So there's certain assumptions or like negotiations that go into the marriage, mila chachila, and those should be honored, like regardless of this Mishnah. So what is the Mishnah then talking about? The Mishnah is then talking about, we're this Galilean couple. We've been so happy here. all of a sudden my husband gets a big job in Yehuda and he wants me to pick up my life and go, he cannot force me to pick up my life and go. I got married on the assumption that we were going to live in the Galilee, and he can't force me to move. So it kind of limits the Mishnah a tiny bit. And then the other thing is, so you can potentially force someone to leave like an idolatrous city, so like, you know, residences of an Ir Nidachat, or like an idolatrous city that's going to get like burned to the ground. So that's sort of that you can force her to move there, but not, and you can't force her to leave a very Jewish city to a city that's very not Jewish. And that's also interesting, and it has a lot of kind of repercussions today. I'm gonna stop in a second because we're at time. And it seems like Lily Naz maybe has a question from somebody for me.
Yes.
Okay, so let me wrap up and then we'll take some questions, then we'll end. This last Mishnah, the last Mishnah in Ketubot, there's on this Mishnah, which I'm not gonna even look at, but it's Hakol Ma'alin La'Eretz Yisrael V'Ein Hakol Motziin. Anyone can force their family to move to Eretz Yisrael, and they can't force them to leave Eretz Yisrael. That is the jumping off point for all of the discussions about whether it's a mitzvah to live in Israel or not. It's really interesting. Interspersed in the Bavli's discussion there is a pretty strong voice of like, well, Bavel's pretty great. And so when you have people like Satmar Hasidim who say, we're not moving to Israel yet, it's not time. This is the Gemara on this Mishnah is where they're rooting those arguments. So if you ever want to learn, you know, but it's also beautiful Gemaras about the land of Israel and about our dreams for a return. So it's quite complicated. And if you ever want to learn just like 4 blot-ish of Gemara about the land of Israel, that very end of Ketubot on this Mishnah is where those are to be found. So just wanted to sort of raise that and make sure that was on everyone's, because these days, I don't know, we started obviously talking about some really heavy things in this class about all the hostages, and we sort of moved away from that. So it's nice to just be able to end with our eyes on Eretz Yisrael and our longing and yearning for the land, even for those of us who do not live there, and the way that even that kind of codified longing and yearning can play out halachically in a marriage, for example, as the kind of beginning and end of our study of these mishnayot together. Yeah, so I'll just leave it there, but that was something that was very much on my mind as sort of just like an inclusio to our class and to our study together. Obviously our hearts and minds are very much still in Eretz Yisrael, and it feels very much like Ketubot has sort of made has sort of given a good like container for that. So thank you all for joining and learning with me, and I'll stick around for a minute or two to answer any questions.
Thank you so
I just
much.
want to re-emphasize that people should sign up for Rabbi Silver's class. Okay.
I have just put the link to sign up to Rabbi Silver's class in the chat if anyone wants to click on that and fill that in whilst we're doing questions. More of a comment than a question, but Pamina says that the Gemara that we were reading before with Ben Sira, that the quote, there's a quote in there that's actually from Mishlei. I wonder, Mishlei 15:15. I wonder why they chose to quote Ben Sira instead.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but that's interesting. I bet there is literature about that though, Pina. I'm just not holding in it.
Great. A question from Rena.
Hi, Rena.
Hi. I had a question. I was wondering if you're teaching any other courses on Zoom open to the public.
Not immediately, but probably after Pesach I will be.
Oh, all right.
Sorry.
It's okay. Yeah. Thank you for the class.
Yeah, thanks for joining.
I have a question too, mostly I think for Lilinas. The classes are not recorded, are they? I mean, do we have access to the recordings later or for forever?
They are absolutely recorded. So pretty much all of Drisha's classes are available on Facebook Live. Very occasionally there's a class that isn't live streamed. And after the live stream, they become just available on Facebook. If there's a class that isn't on Facebook Live for a technical issue, you can always email Drisha and we record it separately from that as well. So there are recordings for pretty much all of Drisha's classes. I will message you the email address that you can email to get links if there's any that you can't find on Facebook.
Very soon our new website will be launching, and a piece of that, the phase 2 of that launch is going to be this enormous audio video library with recordings of Drisha's classes going back decades. So it's been a little slow getting it together, but hopefully it will be enormous and tagged and searchable by teacher and by subject, and it'll be this like incredible online resource of Drisha's Torah. But that is coming like in the coming months.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Debbie. Thanks, everyone. I love learning with you all. I'm really grateful for everyone's questions and creative ideas. It's been really such a pleasure for me. So hopefully we will learn together again soon.
Yes, if that's the end of questions, then I will do the official thank you so much, Rabbanit Sarna, for this class and for this whole course. And thank you to all of our participants for your amazing comments and questions throughout the course. I've already sent the link for the continuation of this project with Masechet Nedarim, with Rabbi Silber. But I just want to remind you that there's always new and exciting courses happening at Drisha, and you can find them at 5784, I think, .drisha.org. And you should sign up for them. And I am looking forward to seeing you all soon at future Drisha classes. Have a great week.
Yes.
I messaged you something, Rabbanit Sarna.
You did? Okay. Oh, okay. Debbie,
Okay.
my email address is sarna@drisha.org. Can you send me an email? Because I'm going to lose this.
Sure.
Yes.